this theme, of course, is very close to, well, it's appropriate that you presented this in this particular space, especially because this space, you may have gotten the background about this space, but it was originally built or renovated by the Association for Historical Dialogue and Research, which whose original task, which is now branched out into various other things, was really to try to bring together history teachers for dialogue and history, and to think about what could be done in the educational systems of the island. The AHDR is now doing much more than that, though there's continuing that. And I don't want to take up a lot of time because I know that there will be a lot of questions, but I want to say a few things from my own experience. You could say as I guess a sort of practitioner or attempted, rather attempting to think about what to do in terms of historical reconciliation in the island. At one point, we had a conference on the politics of the past, and from that there was a lot of interest in bringing together a group of historians and thinking about what it might be possible to do, and as a result of that we brought Olazo Barkan and people from the Institute for Historical Justice and Reconciliation and so on. And there was a certain stubbornness of irreconcilability, I could say. I mean, the various paradigms that you were talking about didn't really ever seem to fit, and or rather, there didn't seem to. The parallel narratives approach, for example, isn't entirely appropriate for Cyprus in the sense that people know the parallel narratives, right? So there's not. I mean, there's not a lot of point in doing that. So, but the one of the things that we also came up against was that, as you remarked when you talked about the difference between Bosnia and the Israel-Palestine case, there's the different approaches there are based on different forms of politics, right? But here, of course, as in Israel and Palestine, you have an unresolved conflict, right? Where one would think that parallel narratives would be a necessary approach. But one thing that we were never able sufficiently to get at was the actual role played by that political impasse in historiography, right? So, I mean, in sort of thinking about it, writing about it since then, I've actually thought about it in a way that may be sort of similar to your own thinking, since you've written about temporality as a kind of change in temporality. In other words, that the move from a divided society to a society with a political solution is also it produces a sort of change in temporality from a sort of time of war to a time of peace, right? Where it's possible actually to make the past. And Yanis Papadakis has also been writing about this. So there's I would pose that temporality has an important role to play here. And again, I know that you've written about this and you were going to present about this originally. So I assume you would have something to say about that. And I also wanted to make a couple of remarks about something that you sort of mentioned in passing, which was that in some of the narratives that you examined, there was a distinction that was being made between basically legitimate and illegitimate narratives, right? Or rather that in some cases, they considered what we might think of as the national or communal or generally accepted narratives to be legitimate, something that should be addressed, and in other cases that they were basically illegitimate, right? And I think that also poses another question. It poses two questions. Okay? One has to do with the relationship between narrative and experience. Okay? In other words, this seems to me to be an insufficiently addressed issue. The way that narratives after conflict and war are not simply narratives that are imposed from above, right? They're co-created with the social memory of violence that emerges out of that experience, right? So it seems to me that the whole narrative approach has a difficulty dealing with that relationship between narrative and experience, and the ways that particularly post-war narratives or post-conflict narratives seem to be co-created with the social memory of violence that emerges there. The other issue is in talking about the difference between, or rather seeing these communal narratives as being legitimate or illegitimate. I took a look at your book because I didn't have your paper, and at one point in your book you talk about allochronicity, right? That there are certain narratives that seem to be out of time or outdated, let's say, and because of that seem to become impediments to putting the past behind, right? That certain narratives appear to be sort of not appropriate to the present.
Seen from a certain
Seen from a certain, exactly. Seen from the perspective of persons who basically already see those narratives as illegitimate, kind of thing. So, but one thing I also wanted to pose was the issue of generation there in seeing such narratives as legitimate or illegitimate. In other words, if those narratives begin to seem outdated, that can also have to do with the issue of simply time passing, right? I mean, generational difference and so on. So I'm going to leave it there because I know that there are going to be lots of questions, and I don't know if you want to say something now, or if you want to open the floor.
I think it's better to make sure that we can answer.
Okay.
If I start talking,
yeah. Okay. Good. All right.
Hard to stop. So,
okay. So
I know myself.
Okay.
However, I just wanted to ask you, I'm not a historian,
Yeah.
so I just wanted some insight on your use of the word perspective in relationship to, let's say, in relationship to truth actually, and to sort of epistemology, and maybe metaphysics in the following sense. When you use the word perspective, are you assuming a pluralist picture of reality? That's my question basically. Yeah, is it assumed that they are all partial, it's partial truth, and that there's a whole picture to be had? That's my question.
Okay.
Others, we're going to take a few more questions first, comments.
As we see, there are unresolved problems, but can we say that during the initiation of during the formation of the nations, there were questions, problems that affected to the present world? Can we say like that? Because, as you know, there was a French Revolution, and in the French nationalism, involved all of the ethnicities, diversities. So, after the French period, there was a corruption, as we say, or counter-revolution that changed to the world, created different borders, national states, and so on, and the problems came out. And I think with the establishment of the Cyprus Republic also, the same mistakes that created national problems after the French Revolution affected Cyprus as well. Can we say like that? Can we conclude like that? And how can we find a solution?
That's a very good question already. Not too many of them because.
Okay, maybe two. Well, it has to be named. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you very much both. It was very interesting. I'm not sure if what I'm asking was already asked by Rebecca because I couldn't hear the beginning. But I was wondering what happens to historiography of reconciliation in case that we move societies to societies with an unresolved problem. Like it seems, because in Cyprus we are in a conference of historical democratic society, but certainly in this society that I know better, there are people who do not see Cyprus as a divided society, but Cyprus as a society, as two societies and more, with an unresolved political problem in a certain sense. So I was wondering what happens to the historiography of reconciliation after the failure of reconciliation.
Maybe I have to introduce myself because there was reference to the Association of Historical Research. I'm Gilagos Pakoulidis and I'm the president of the association and one of the founding members of the association. Thank you for your presentation and thank you for dealing with this issue that, as has been said, is one of the core activities and concerns of the Association of Historical Development Research. If I to add an additional aspect in in the relation between historiography and reconciliation, that was one of our, and it's still one of our concerns and difficulties dealing with. There is one, from the one side, the UN and the Council of Europe directives and reports on how historiography and history teaching can be linked. And at the same time, there is this disciplinary approach to history teaching where the emphasis is being given to the end of the goal, but to the process. So the emphasis is given to the skills that a student should be given in order to be able to approach the task in a more disciplinary way, in a way that and having the skills, let's say, that a historian used to have when approaching the historical past. So, and this is actually, as I said, one of our, we try to balance between these two approaches, especially taking into consideration that we are in a political environment where efforts link history teaching with the reconciliation many times are perceived or presented as efforts of propaganda and manipulation.
Yeah, this is
Very good question to follow up from Kyriakos. Thinking that the main way of engaging with knowledge today is simply through Google. And Google will immediately throw out at you various sources. Doesn't the approach of Kyriakos make sense in the sense that you just should teach people how to differentiate between sources and deal with contradictory sources? Thank you.
Well, I'd rather try to, otherwise I'll
okay.
start to mix it all up, mixed narrative. Okay, let me see. Yeah, I mean the question on, maybe first your last question on generation and narration and time passing, it's a logical question, it's a very intuitive one, and I have often encountered that. For example, I'm working on this, I have this notion of what I call spectrality, coming from Jacques Derrida. It's another vision of time than chronological. And one of the things is that I say that, but that's really philosophically, right? Is making a differentiation between past, present, and future is not that easy. People would always say, yeah, but well, I mean, if enough, that, and I also say that the approach of thinking that time heals all wounds, that is a problematical one. And people will indeed say, yeah, okay, for one generation maybe, but you know, 2 generations, 3 generations later. Well, I mean, I don't know, because what I've often seen is that generations of victims or perpetrators are very successful in making their children, grandchildren inherit their memories, not in the same way, but sometimes even much more radicalized. And there's reason for that because they, well, I can explain that. But the thing is, for example, I am coming from Belgium. In Belgium, we of course also have a sort of a divided society. Not violent up to now, I hope it never becomes. But the thing is that I, for example, have good friends who are the children of collaborators during the Second World War, actually children of Flemish SS, so Flemish guys who went with the SS and fight on the Eastern Front. And I could reason with these. One of them is a philosopher. You can talk about everything, up to the point that it comes to that, and then total irrationality comes in, and it's impossible to discuss this. It's impossible. And what I found out is that it's not about cognitive discussions. It's about the loyalty that this person has toward his grandfathers, who were both his heavily well affected. And these people live in a small community, and they have their own, I call it their own moral universe and also historical universe. And they constitute a small part of society, partly because many of them lost their civil rights for a long time. And they are actually now the core force, one of the core forces of the renewed Flemish nationalism in Belgium. And they have so much force, of course, because yeah, I mean, this is an issue that is emotional, that is loyalty to dead. Loyalty to dead people is a loyalty that is very difficultly negotiated, right? You can't negotiate with dead people, so that's different. On French nationalism, well, on the perspective, that is a very, very difficult question. Generally, we have, well, many historians have the notion of temporal perspective. The idea that, for example, a historian gets a kind of epistemic privilege over contemporary actors because he has hindsight. He looks back and he sees. We, for example, can see the First World War differently because we know there comes a Second World War and so on. But that's one kind of perspective. You have people who speak about, like Frank Ankersmith with his aspects theory. That's another. Well, I can't go into that. We should discuss it on another point because this is an epistemically very difficult discussion. What I do believe here is that in this case, the right to historical perspective is directly related indeed, again, to cultural rights of having your heritage. And I have to say that heritage up to now by the UN, by UNESCO was mainly conceptualized as material heritage. But recently you have the immaterial heritage movement, which I have had discussions with, and that's much more difficult because they try to protect habits. It can go from carnival, it can go to guilds who shoot bows or shoot, and the interesting thing is that UNESCO sells this as, again, also something for reconciliation and democracy. And I had discussions with these people because many of these habits come from pre-modern, pre-democratic medieval times. For example, they want to make this participatory, open, this organization, and then they stuck with like guilds who don't want to allow women. Women shooting arrows and bows, no, we can't do that. I mean, there's a certain tension in that UNESCO discourse of why would we safeguard this? I mean, shouldn't we be more critical and say some things we just don't want to say? I'm not attached to men only shooting arrows and bows in these clubs. Well, anyway. Well, French nationalism, I personally am coming from two families. I'm a little bit of a, I come from a French-speaking bourgeois family, military and industrial complex, let's say, and they spoke French in the middle of Flanders. On my other side, my father's side, was Flemish nationalist. These were really nice family parties. So I know some of the motives for nationalism. I know, for example, that Flemish was suppressed. That there were cases. My own university was French-speaking for a long time. They considered Flemish as a non-language for sciences. People were judged, for example, before judges in a language they didn't understand. And on the other hand, I also see, and indeed my grandmother basically despised, my bourgeois grandmother, she really despised Flemish. She spoke it perfectly, but she would never put Flemish television on, or I mean, that was for common people. But I always say to Flemish messages, be creative. Don't think of it as despising Flemish people. They should just despise all laborers. Whether they were from this country or proletarians of all countries were united for her. You know? So basically, this family background turned me very critical of this kind of nationalism, which in Belgium also attaches to xenophobia. And I personally think that the basic idea of nationalism, which is, there are many definitions of that, but one of the major definitions is that a nation, as a cultural unit, sometimes ethnological ethnic unity, has to coincide with a political unity. Well, this is not the case in Belgium right now, and I'm not regretting that. I think it's good that we have political unities that are not mono-national. And well, I live in this society. I mean, people do get along. Some don't. I don't see why, but anyway. Now, divided societies, this unresolved political problem. Well, of course, we can think of, for example, some of the people I supervise does a PhD on slavery in the US. That's an unresolved problem in the sense that is at least what those in favor of reparations claim. That is that slavery is directly for them attached to current day inequalities, and that's an interesting discussion. It's a very difficult discussion. It's a very interesting one. I do believe that it's important to step. Well, I mean, societies can be divided in many ways. This island is divided in a rather clear-cut way, in the sense that it's geographical. Of course, again, if one thinks of social inequality, as it was mentioned yesterday, life expectancy, for example, or cities. I live in a city where there's a great tourist center. It's a beautiful city, Kent, in Belgium. But what many people don't know, due to really successful city marketing, is that once you step some streets further, there's a lot of poverty. And that's literally one street further. I mean, one street away, sometimes there's shootings, or that's very strange, and that's a divided society. It's nothing else. You know. And indeed, and what I would say is unresolved problems. The idea is that we should certainly not blame the victims for not being able to resolve it. We should also look at conflicting interests. I believe personally that in a lot of transitional justice discourse, some lessons could be learned from Marxist and more materialist philosophically seen theories. That, for example, thinking about conflict is really meager. It's very strange because the core object of transitional justice is conflict, and conflict itself is not addressed. It's all about the reconciliation part and so on, but why is it? Not just for narratives. Narratives do matter, I do believe, but it's not just that. There are conflicting interests. And yeah, for me, Marxist theory still is a critical tool there. Skills to use critical thinking, yes, I believe this is really important. That's why I ended with this disclaimer. I think you should go on doing this. I do see that there are forms of, I mean, if you've seen the documentary of yesterday and what could be told in this society, that is shocking. That it could openly be told, that it can be told by officials in official meetings and so on. That shows that there's a big problem, and education certainly plays a very important role there. So yeah, I do believe that focusing not just on the content but more on the process and the learning of the skills is important. On a more advanced level of university teaching, and myself as a researcher, I try to sometimes unlearn some of these classical critical ideas, because I believe that certain reasonability keeps us from seeing certain dynamics and so on. So I sometimes try to take a position to be not too reasonable, and actually this is the thing, as an academic you sometimes study what you consider the good guys, like in this case, or like in a case where I, together with a colleague, studied exhumations of victims of Franco in Spain, and you want to study the long-term political implications of some of the things that they do, then you have to be critical. Then it's not always a nice position. It's not, they don't really like it, and well, that's what we do. But for example, what I try to show is that using the discourse of memory is a hugely important discourse internationally seen. It gives you a lot of power. It's a tool that you should strategically use, but always remembering that you step in what Hannah Arendt would call the realm of contemplation more than politics and action. And that's a little bit of a possible problem. I always give the example, beautiful example of somebody from the Madres de Plaza de Mayo in Argentina, who, a commenter, and there was a disappearance while I was there, 2007 I think, of a witness in a tribunal, and they were shocked. I mean, this was the return of the part, this was, can this happen still in 2007? Do they disappear witnesses? And yes, he never returned. And there is a long tradition of course, protesting against it. So there was a big protest march, and they were shouting. He was called Cabezas, Julio Cabezas, and they were shouting, "Let's not forget Cabezas, let's not forget Cabezas." And one of the mothers said, "Oh, don't use this discourse of forgetting and remembering. Action we need. This guy disappeared yesterday. It's not, we should remember. Okay, let's all not forget about it. No, this guy has to return." Now, he didn't return, it didn't work out, but nevertheless, as a claim to politics, you shouldn't just say. Or to give another example, there was a campaign in Belgium by Doctors Beyond Borders or Without Borders. It's not the same as Medicines Without Borders, but anyway. Or Doctors for the World, it's called. It's coming from a left-wing background, probably Marxist, I think, and they had this thing, and it was 5 minutes of your attention for those people that are increasingly being forgotten in the world. And I was thinking, is that really what you need, my 5 minutes of attention here? And is that what replaces your previously more structural analysis of how we actually are responsible for the exploitation indirectly and in complex ways of these people, through theories of exploitation, theories of underdevelopment, through globalization and so on, which can be discussed and so on, but as an analysis I think it has more critical potential than just memorial. No, I said just, because it's also very important. You need to just be careful. Okay.
Probably
take
to wrap it
one
up.
or two more.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, thank you very much, Barbara. I very much enjoyed that. I wanted to raise the question perhaps a bit more explicitly than you did in your paper on the role of democratic pluralist societies for historical reconciliation, or the importance, rather, of democratic pluralist societies. So in a way, my question would be, doesn't the kind of discourse and the success of the kind of discourse that you use in reconciliation depend to a very large extent to the maturity of democratic pluralist society? So in a way, whatever frame you use for historical reconciliation is a precondition for that, not the creation of such, if you like, democratic pluralism. And to use a recent example from Britain, the Scottish referendum, which also had a strong historical component to it, although the SNP was at pains to deny it. And I think it's quite remarkable the extent to which you had a massive debate which politicized, especially the younger generation, to an extent that many societies can only dream of. And yet, after the decision, it was immediately accepted and people sort of, in a way, got on with their lives. So it seems to me that in order to successfully negotiate conflict, including historical conflict, isn't one of the key preconditions that kind of democratic pluralism?
Thank you. First of all, let me say how much I enjoyed and congratulations for your lecture and also Professor Davis's lecture. Usually it's happy to have lectures with polemics or advocacy, so it was good to have such substantive lectures. Thank you. Having said that, I would be a bit provocative perhaps. You were talking about the Palestinian rapporteur of the report, and it reminded me very much of another debate of cultural relativity in human rights. It's another perspective to have a female genital mutilation. It's my human right. I can sell my 12-year-old daughter as a bride. It's my cultural right. So the question of relativity
I'm sure you will want to comment on that. And taking that another step further, when you do experiments, usually it's good to have extreme cases. So if you were to take the concentration camps and the Holocaust, then you have the Nazi perspective, works, makes free, and the Jewish or the other victims' perspectives, equal validity. It touches upon that core question, I feel. When we talk also about different narratives, we tend to assume that one side of the conflict has same narrative, all of that side, all the members of that side. And that reminds me something personal. Soon after 74, after the invasion of 74, so perhaps I should say the peace operation that liberated me from my home in Famagusta, and went to a university in Birmingham, and having no money, the only place we could eat was the student union. And the guy who was next to me was a Turkish student. His narrative and his explanation had nothing to do with what you might say the Turkish narrative. So I think one must be careful as well about that, whether it's the Greek Cypriot, the Turkish Cypriot, the Palestinian, the Jewish, Israeli narrative. It's not one thing. And finally, I would say that perhaps historiography is a subject that should be dealt with by historians as well as by socio-psychological and political investigations. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks. Okay, maybe start with the last one and then come to. Yes, I think Shahid is quite conscious of the risk of cultural relativism, but she doesn't seem to bring a solution. Also, she's, for example, quite conscious of the tension between good revision, which is the lifeline of historiography. I mean, if we wouldn't revise our things, we would still be stuck with the, let's say, 19th century vision on medieval times, and we actually wouldn't have any jobs anymore because history would dry out, right? So you need to revise. We have several sources of revision, that is finding new archives, having ourselves new political perspectives. Let's say, for example, social democracy or Marxism brings social history. Feminism brings a great intellectual revolution in thinking of women in history. Ecological movement has brought us ecological history. So political subjectivism is not always bad. The same can be that we have new events. For example, 11th of September brought a great amount of studies on historical terrorism and so on, histories of terrorism. So, I mean, these are positive forms of, positive as seen as academic. But of course, there's also the kind of revisionism that makes Holocaust deniers sell their stories and so on. And she literally says how to find a way in between. And I believe that she takes the road, she's not explicitly saying, she's a sociologist of training, she's really smart, that's pretty clear. And she, I think, takes a route that I will also take, and that is social epistemology, and trying to find, not to look at the product, but at the truth that comes out, but the conditions under which knowledge is created, and whether it's, for example, social epistemologists would say you have more chance to encounter knowledge in cases that the community producing it is pluralist. So it's, for example, not only men, but also women. It's not only from one class, it's not from one ethnicity, but mixed. That it is large enough, that it's not just a small club producing your things, and that it's uncoerced. It's not forced by some state intervention or so on. If you have these conditions, the chance that you will have knowledge is bigger. That's the only way to do it if you're not neither a relativist nor a absolute positivist. That's, I believe, what she's trying. She's not really succeeding in because she's working within a certain frame, that is cultural rights, and that is a difficult frame to work in. Yeah, I do believe that if you would apply some of these things as the right and historical perspective to the Holocaust, that would be totally unacceptable, and that shows how, of course, these narrativist approaches are only working in a certain frame. I believe that, for example, the interventionist frame of the narratives on Yugoslavia have to do with the fact that there are actually Americans leading the team, and it's actually quite anti-Serbian, for example. If you read that book, it's not openly, but they apparently, for example, say you have the Serbian narrative and the narrative of all the others. So, and that is possible because they are from the US and working in that frame, and so it wouldn't be possible for the Holocaust or. And then, yes, I totally agree that claiming that there's a single narrative in a single, and that there are national narratives, it's a problem. It's a problem that comes with this dual or parallel narratives, and I think they're aware of it. For example, there's a passage where they say, we don't claim to represent everybody, we claim to represent 60 to 70% of the national. So I don't know how they measured that, but that's the big, yeah, you try to reconcile two narratives, but then you forget about all these minorities that don't share that. Another thing is, well, can go wrong, but for example, I have the impression of the 300, or no, yeah, and then maybe, yeah, also a very difficult question. Yes, of course, there's a direct relation between the successful pluralist democracy and reconciliation. Now, of course, that's not a coincidence. We define a pluralist democracy not just by majority rule, but protection of minorities. That is clearly showing to be able to deal with conflict without violence, right? If there's a definition of reconciliation which is not harmony and then that's the definition. So basically, yes, there's this very close, and that's the reason why it works between France and Germany. Clearly, I mean, it's much more difficult in other societies. So indeed, you see that the most successful common narratives, shared narratives, come in those societies that already found a way to deal with it on other levels. Well, I do believe is again very dangerous in transitology discourse. There's a lot of stress on democracy as the prime mover, and they then also not just stress democracy, but democratic elites that teach the others and so on. It's a very hopeful discourse because you can go to Africa and train some democratic elites and there will be democracy. It doesn't work. It doesn't work because it doesn't see that there are many other factors involved. And one thing we have to be really careful of, there's of course democracy as a process, there's democracy as a substance. The substance is people rule, let's say. The process is the whole mechanism with the checks and balances and so on. Great, the process should be used for researching all the checks and balances and so on. It should not be applied to the final narrative. Because if you let Germans and Jews decide whether the Holocaust exists or not nice. Not nice.
Probably agree.
Well, now after.
It took some time.
We defeated you in such a way that we dare to use another narrative. And so, of course, but that's so interesting about the German Vergangenheit as well, how to think of it without an Allied victory. Would have been a completely different story, I believe.
Okay, so I think we have to allow you going to have a break. How long?
I think we should meet again at 12 here.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so we begin again at 12.